Now, the fundamentals of China-Africa relationship has always been political. People keep thinking that China-Africa relationship took off because of the BRI. Yes, what the BRI and FOCAC really did was expand the economic dimension of the relationship.
African head of states tends to start criticizing Western involvement in the internal affairs only when they're about to mess up either the constitutions or either they're about to do something that may displease the international democratic community. So that's why they start talking about sovereignty. You know, my country is sovereign, we are independent, we are free to do whatever we want.
The thing about the Cold War is that, and this has been said many times, it's Cold War for the main players and a hot war for the rest of the world who do not understand how to play with the main players. Yeah, exactly. So the Cold War era was very devastating for the continent, and the dynamics are very clear. You know, again, that we're entering that space.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Welcome to this special edition of the China in Africa podcast. It's a very special edition today because it's both the China in Africa podcast and the China Global South interview. I'm Christian Géraud. I'm the Africa editor of the China Global South project. And today, this is a special edition where we are going to talk about the geopolitical changes that are happening in Africa and what does it mean for the rest of the world. Coups have happened in the last 3 years in Niger, in Mali, in Guinea, and other places in Africa. Geopolitical tension have risen in the world over the supply chain of critical minerals that many African countries are producing, which puts a lot of African countries in the crosshair of US, China, EU geopolitical tension over those critical minerals. And the aftermath of the war in Ukraine and the crisis in Gaza, all of those situations came in a moment where Africa is really at the crossroad of those tensions and created new configuration. And last year with the BRICS summit, we see the BRICS expanded. Originally 6, but 5 members. Argentina declined to join in January 2024. In the BRICS now, we have Egypt and Ethiopia who joined South Africa among the BRICS member. So we have 3 African countries in that BRICS organization. All of that have impacted Africa in one way or another. It's changed the Africa geopolitical landscape. And in this time of tectonic changes, the question is, who stands to lose and who stands to win? Who are the winners and we are the loser in that new configuration? And to talk about it, I'm receiving a good friend of mine, a good friend of the China Global South project. We've had him before on the China in Africa podcast. It's Ovigwe Eguegu. Ovigwe Eguegu is a political analyst at Development Reimagined. He specializes in geopolitics with a particular reference to Africa and the change in the global order, which makes him basically the very perfect guest to have. Ovigwe works focus on policy-oriented research, consulting, and publishing on how great power politics affects development in the region, paying close attention to the security and the geoeconomics of all these changes that happen in the world and in Africa. Ovigwe, good afternoon. I know you are on the road and I'm really grateful to have you for this conversation. How are you, my friend?
I'm very, very fine. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today for this important show.
Oh, yeah, it's really nice to have you on this conversation because we've been talking about it offline. Now we're talking about it online. We say, let's have this conversation so people can kind of learn about things that have changed in Africa, how things are changing, and what we should really kind of learn and take away from these changes. To start our conversation, let me jump right away to one comment that came last week when President Tshisekedi from the DRC was visiting France and Belgium. He was a guest on the French television LCI, and he made a very interesting comment about the situation right now. It's going to be in French, but I'm going to translate for our audience.
Pour moi, le plus important, c'est de réajuster le point de vue, la manière d'aborder la coopération, les partenariats, ne plus nous considérer comme des sous-hommes, mais nous regarder comme de vrais partenaires avec qui on peut faire affaire positive, constructive, et non pas toujours comme de dominé à dominant. Hein, donc,
mais Monsieur le Président,
et ça,
pardon.
si c'est reconsidéré, je crois que ça peut changer les choses.
Comment comprenez-vous que, apparemment, la Chine ou la Russie, qui ne sont pas des régimes démocratiques, eux, arrivent à progresser en Afrique?
Mais parce qu'ils ne viennent pas avec cette approche-là. Ils ne viennent pas avec cette arrogance, cette façon de donner des leçons qui est frustrante, en fait.
Vous voulez dire que les Chinois ou les Russes se comportent mieux que nous, occidentaux, actuellement, selon vous?
Mais bien sûr. On ne comprend pas très bien les réalités africaines. Et c'est vraiment dommage, parce que moi, j'ai toujours dit que l'Europe, par exemple, c'est le meilleur partenaire de l'Afrique, par son histoire et aussi par sa position géographique. Nous sommes deux continents qui sont très proches. Mais c'est étonnant de voir comment nous sommes très loin par rapport aux cultures.
Mais comment, pardon, Monsieur le Président, comment soutenir ça?
On ne peut pas comprendre qu'on vienne nous donner des leçons, par exemple, sur les droits de l'homme.
So here we have President Tshisekedi, who made a very interesting comment, because they were asking him, basically, with the changes that's happening, how do you understand that China, Russia's are making headways in Africa, moving forward in Africa, gaining ground? And he said they're making ground because China and Russia are coming in Africa with the less arrogant approach. They're respecting African countries. They're not coming to give lessons and criticizing African states. They're coming with a position of learning, and they know the context of African society. They kind of adapt to the environment. I'm paraphrasing what he's saying. But in the gist of what he's saying is really expressing that China and Russia have a much different approach than the West in Africa. They don't come and criticize in terms of human rights violations, good governance, and everything. And that's, according to him, that explains why they're gaining ground in Africa. Ovigwe, what was your take when you heard President Tshisekedi? And take us really what you think about all that comment. Does it make a valid point in that debate?
Yeah, I don't think there's a better way to actually encapsulate or explain the concern of many African leaders, many African policymakers and experts regarding the main criticisms in the relationship between Africa and the American axis, or conceptual West as it were. That is because this is a very old, I would even say tired complaint from the African side. Leaders after leaders, administration after administration, who found presidents coming on to say, look, the problem with our relationship with the West is not that we don't want to cooperate with the West, but the atmosphere under which the discussion of cooperation is being had doesn't feel like our sovereignty or statehood, or even our presence is respected. We're being given lectures and all of that. That is really essentially the number one complaint, or often cited complaint you will hear. Is the one thing everybody in Africa seems to agree on in the criticism of the West. However, I'm of the opinion that we should really go beyond just these complaints and saying this is how they treat us. They don't treat us right. I was telling someone a few weeks ago that there's a tendency for many African leaders to see geopolitics as a playground in a school, in a primary school, in a secondary school, where if someone offends you, you have to run to the headmistress or the headmaster or your teacher to say, look, Jimmy offended me, or Géraud, for instance, offended me. Please, come sanction Géraud and
Come do something.
So if you do that, even you come off as being unserious, actually. If you do that in playground, it's fine. But in the adult world of politics, you could, of course, raise your concerns publicly. Initially, if this was the 60s when we were getting our independence, it's fine, right? But decades after, it's baffling that we're still at this point where we are raising our hands to say, look, we're not being treated right. No, we're not the only ones. You have countries in Asia also that, of course, have been experiencing any condescending attitudes towards them. Maybe they are dealing with it in a very different way. Of course, there have been some complaints here and there, even from Russia. I mean, if you listen to the inauguration of President Putin, he did mention that they are actually willing to discuss with the West, but as equals. right? So if President Putin is also complaining, it tells you this is not something that is unique to African countries. And from my view, I would say we ought at this point to not only use that as an issue with our relationship and say, okay, we want to change the relationship, but we're not talking anymore. Let's take actions. Let's work in a manner that can improve. However, the point that Russia and China are making inroads into the continent because they have a different approach cannot be missing on anyone, whether African or non-African, because I think that is something that you would see in the, of course, I'm not someone who sits in the negotiation rooms talking to all of these states, Russia, China, this and all of that. But you often hear from the African side and elsewhere that when it comes to the state-state relationship and engagement, diplomatic engagements, they get that sense of being treated as equals, particularly when they're talking to the Chinese and the Russians. Maybe the Chinese and the Russians understand that this is something that they, have to deal with, and their counterparts in Africa would appreciate it if they engage with Africa in that manner.
Ovigwe, let me step you there. Here I'm going to be the devil advocate for the West and the G7 and the Western countries. One of the criticisms that comes often, people say that African head of states tends to start criticizing Western involvement in the internal affairs only when they're about to mess up either the constitutions or either they're about to do something that may displease the international democratic community. So that's why they start talking about sovereignty. My country is sovereign. We are independent. We are free to do whatever we want. And President Tshisekedi he even came back to say how they can come and criticize about human rights. Because what he's pretending on the other side is say, when China and Russia comes here, they don't criticize our human rights situation. They don't talk about it. So many would say that, yes, it's easy to say we're independent, we should have a different approach, which I agree. I agree totally about that. That, there is a time where we have to remove that sense of hierarchical sense of where we come to tell you what you need to do and what you have to do and everything, to kind of understanding what you need to do and what you want. But on the other side, we cannot also behave as if, especially head of state in Africa, behave as if when our partners, and especially those donors giving us billions of dollars because of our own bad governance, because of our own corruption, and when they come, they ask for accountability, we behave as if, no, they're coming to meddle in my internal affairs. So this is for me a bit of my criticism on that approach. It's really, they pick and choose the moment they decide to become friendly or to raise the independence and sovereign perspective on that situation.
First point to make on that is where a particular country receives aid, whether for budgetary concerns or I give you money. I mean, let's go away from politics. If you have a friend or a relative that you give money to run his home, right? If you are giving him advice or you are scolding him, people are really going to be like, yeah, you have grounds to scold this person or to criticize this person because you invest in that person. That person takes your money. Right?
Exactly.
So this is all politics, but it all comes down to human psychology and human behavior. Yeah. Fundamentally, what gives the West the position or any form of justification to lecture and to say, this is how you should run a government, this is how you should do those things, is because they see themselves as vested interest because their money is involved. And that is one excuse, or that's one way to explain why they act in the manner in which they do. However, I'm going to say that even in countries where they are not financially involved, the attitude is still there and they still have that, we are the standard and you have to learn from us. Yeah. So there is that. But to your point that African countries, African leaders tend to select and choose when they raise up this issue of sovereignty. I mean, it goes back to the push and pull that you have in relationships, particularly at the state level. If as a country, you lecture me and I don't have any other way to make you not lecture me or to not criticize me, then I'm going to go with the international norms card to say, look, I'm a sovereign state, you can't tell me what to do, which you agree to, it's actually fact and it's true. To a large extent, over the years, also another issue that African countries and everyone all over the world, you could say, or most people all over the world would say have with the West is where they're not essentially standard bearers of human rights in their foreign conduct and even domestically in many instances. So why should we have to listen to people who didn't are not perfect? So I think that is the complexity of the situation. So on one hand, you have the issue of hypocrisy. Then there's the issue of, yes, I can criticize you because I'm actually giving you funding for your country.
Exactly.
But of course, there's also the international norms that says, no, you really cannot just do that, even when you give me finance. Just like between you and your family, friends, or anybody, there's no rule written down anywhere. But in international relations, there's a rule written down that you cannot impede on my sovereignty. Yeah.
Exactly. You talking about hypocrisy just reminds me of a piece I've wrote a few weeks back when I was saying that the hypocrisy of the international community in the crisis that we see, for example, in Gaza, makes it really much more difficult today for the West to come with a narrative to try to kind of lecture African countries. And it's also opening doors for the narrative for China in Africa when China is saying that we need to reform the international system. We need a new rule-based order because the one that we have right now is much more US Western centered than anything else. And because of how we see them behaving, this kind of narrative will start to take shape in Africa, where you have a lot of head of state who say, yes, we really don't agree with the way the West does things. And especially when we saw how they reacted with the war in Ukraine with Russia and the way they're behaving right now in Gaza faced toward Israel, you kind of wonder why the double standard. And African country, when they see that, when they listen to that, they're kind of like, that makes sense that for us, the international rule-based order is not really fair as it was presented to be. It's much more hypocritical kind of rule-based order. And when China comes and say, you need to support me to have a new configuration of the rule-based order, they kind of say, yeah, we're going to go with you.
Very good analysis, by the way, very convincing. The first thing I want to say regarding to that is we don't even need the Russians or the Chinese to come tell us that the system is unfair. Because since independence till now, generation after generation of leaders, even after independence, we could see how unfair several countries were treated even in the decolonization process. The reason you have Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger having coups today and seeing all of the agreements and pacts with France that they are counseling, if you read those documents, there's no way you would agree that a sovereign country will sign this, or this is even a fair arrangement. So overall, we on our own have been very, very vocal without any foreign partner telling us this is unfair. We know what unfair is because we actually went through colonialism, and then the decolonization process was very, very incomplete in several ways. And since we've seen Russia and China with the West having a lot of contention in their relationship with China, Russia trying to build an alternative system, China doesn't, and many countries, I would even say, do not recognize the rules-based international order, as it is said, because nobody knows what the rules are. Exactly. There's international law, which we know based on the UN Charter, this is what all countries, at least countries who are in the UN system, have agreed to. And that is very clear for everyone to see. We know what happens when there's conflict somewhere, what organ of the UN is supposed to act, what's the role of the United Nations Security Council. They even came up with the United for Peace formula several years ago. So that is well established. But the rules-based international order comes across to anyone who has paid any attention to it, as essentially, and I've described this in a discussion to say, it's like myself and my friends, we set up rules and then we're going to impose it on the rest of the world without them even knowing what the rules are. So we just decide what the rules would be and when and where should be applied. So that's a challenge. And African countries, in my opinion, they do not want to be cajoled in, and nobody actually wants to be cajoled into such a system. Some people want to play within it if they win. I told this to a few friends during an event, actually with a US-based organization. I said, look, if we had countries like Japan and South Korea in Africa, countries who won under the hierarchy and the system that was created post-45 and even post-Bretton Woods, you will find many allies on the continent of Africa.
Definitely,
today.
No question asked.
But the way it is on the continent of Africa is that you can't find winners of the current system. So why would you now expect champions to emerge from a continent where there were no winners, right?
Yeah.
So over the decades, what we've just had is countries who have not been able to industrialize, or they're just told, you know what, you're just going to be commodity suppliers. That's fine.
But Ovigwe, let me stop you there for a moment. Is it the international system at fault, or is it internal country bad governance at fault in that case?
That's a very interesting question, and I would really like us to go in this direction. So let's look at when we left colonial era, many countries nationalized their resources, right? Mm-hmm. So we had that in Ghana, we had that in Zimbabwe, in many countries across the continent. They saw that as a way to build some form of industrial base and then piggyback off protectionism, then they progressively liberalized. There was not a single country that didn't face pushback from the West. And as at the time, the West is and still is to a large extent, the home of foreign capital. They were the ones that can give you access to technologies. They were the ones that can give you access to capital to invest. In the first place, in this mine, China was not the big player then. Of course, the USSR to some extent was still an actor. But overall, if the model that was built when Germany, the United States, France were still the industrial powers was importing raw materials from former colonies now to their factories, well, that's what African countries were faced with. When you nationalize, the money to build your industry and supply chain, it's not going to fall from the sky. You still need to go to where capital was, and capital wasn't coming from the West because they do not want African countries to go in that direction. So it is not written down as we will not let you industrialize, or we will not let you, go into the local refining of your resources. But it's just by withholding capital that is what you get, where there was no alternative. But now, if you look at Zimbabwe, for instance, just last week we saw news in Mukoto in Zimbabwe. See what they've been able to achieve, for instance, or what they're trying to do with steel, with lithium. See what Indonesia is also doing with nickel, for instance. Indonesia is able to block nickel export raw and say, we want to do this. But why are they able to do it now? Because they have alternative people who can make those investments. If it was only the West that could put capital into Indonesia, they would not be able to succeed in doing what they are going to do.
So basically, China offered an option for many African producing countries now to kind of have a leverage to be able to exist in that international order by providing capitals to those African countries to start the refining, right? That's what you're saying, if I understand correctly. That China now, basically, China offered option to African countries to have a certain level of agency. I'm not sure that I agree with the president's statement that we had about withholding capital, because I'm not going to get in that debate, but let's face it, many African countries had corruption. We had regime that was richer than the country. We had regime that was embezzling billions of dollars that could have been used for the economy, that could have been used for refining, that could have been used for processing. But you're going to see most of those countries. I'm going to take Zaire, my country, DR Congo today. We had we had Géraud that was producing a lot, but millions were just embezzled for personal wealth and personal gain. So we cannot just really say that the international rule-based order was set against us. I know it was not set for us, for sure. It was not set for us because we are not part of it. When the system was set, we are not part of it. So basically, when you're not there, if something is set, you can assume safely that it's not set for your gain. That's quite clear for me. But we cannot also say that it was actively working into making us and keeping us poor, when we overlook the fact that many of our heads of state were just corrupted. They had money. You take a country like Gabon. Money's there, the temperature was there, but you have the Bongos family with billions having castle in Europe and everything. That's just beside the point. But to get back to what you're saying, yes, China rivals in Africa now today offers that opportunity for many African producing countries, since you talk about resources, to be in that space where they can now have agency. They can now ask for refineries. They can now ask for processing. Zimbabwe is now winning, having first level lithium processing built into the ground. Up to last year, there are like 5 to 6 now lithium processing that are running in the country, which is a good thing. So yeah, China has offered that opportunity that I think that many countries are now appreciating in Africa.
Yeah, of course, again, they don't offer the agency. What they offer is opportunity. And that is why you find in many cases, countries are saying, see, I will tell you, I've spoken to so many people across the continent that they come up as pro-China, but to the extent that what they really want is just to have the China option. Because if you're in a system where you're only beholden to only one power, the kind of hegemony, which we've seen, and we've been at the bottom of the system that's currently changing now, You don't need to tell an African what his place is in the current world order. It's very clear. Just look at the last 50 years. But having that option, it's precisely why you find so many takers for what China represents, and even Russia, right? So that is the first point to make. Secondly, the point you made about corrupt African leaders in Zaire and Gabon, who were the countries, the foreign powers that supported those regimes to be there in the first place? Who was Mobutu's closest ally?
United States, Belgium, France, and everything. Yeah.
Exactly. Who was the closest ally to the Bongo family?
France. But do they ask them to steal, though? That's the question. They were supporting them.
No. This is the point. See, if you say those examples of corruption is why those countries were not able to build refining capacity and value addition, then we now have to ask the question, who benefits from the status quo of export only? In terms of trade, because if that system was not beneficial, these powers, whether Belgium, France, Italy, etc., I mean, regime change is well documented across the continent. Yeah, so this is nothing controversial. This is just the history as it is. In the continent, now we're seeing a new wave of coups and a new wave of calls of change, and we're trying to see what these regimes are going to do. A lot of people are excited, expecting that everything's going to change. I remain a cautious optimist because one can speak the language of change and improving lives and quality of life for people of his country. We've seen that so many times, and then they get into power.
We're used to those rhetoric.
Exactly. So I'm not one to immediately say, now we've seen some of these leaders who are now on the other side doing the same things of regime change and speaking a different language, that would then translate to better outcomes for the people. I think fundamentally, Africa should not miss the opportunity, especially African countries that are rich in critical minerals, should not miss the opportunity. They have to be bullish on value addition. That is the only way. We miss oil, we miss all of those other resources with critical minerals, and not every African country is rich in critical minerals, but those who are rich in critical minerals, many of them will not be able to. You can't build an entire lithium value chain in, say, maybe the Congo, and then plus exports. But maybe Congo, Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa can build something. Can build a very fantastic supply chain where the mine in
Zimbabwe
and the mine in Congo is producing the raw materials. There's some refining done there. And then between Katanga and the Port Elizabeth or Durban in South Africa, you have a product we have so much value that all of these countries are going to benefit. Only one African country doesn't have to do it by itself. And I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to push back on the resource nationalism. Like, look, let's not go into that space, because to build a chain in one country is inefficient and is very, very expensive. But if you have countries coming together to do it, they can do it so fantastically well, and they just have to work out what the sharing formula would be.
But what you just mentioned really kind of talk to one of the things I like to talk about, critical minerals and the approach that African countries should take. The question becomes now, individually, each African country, I do believe, doesn't have the capacity to address the challenges that are required to build a solid and viable, economically profitable value chain locally. They don't. Most of them, they have to rely to each other's competitive advantage to be able to create something that really can help them move forward. But the question becomes, when we advocate for this approach, we tend to forget the competitive nature of first African country. And that also comes with the wealth that natural resources gives you. And the third element, we also tend to forget the internal political economy of each African country in the way they see natural resources and how it helps keep regime in power, how it helps strengthen governance and everything. So we have cooperation on one hand to be able to have that collective resource approach that we have to build local value chain, but you also have the competitive aspects of it. Because the question becomes, how do you convince a country that rely on the revenue of natural resources, that really feed the government, that really feed the patronage, cronyism that we see in many countries? And how do you convince the political leaders and also the public opinion by saying that, the minerals that are coming out of my land are going to go in your neighboring country to be transformed there, processed there, and moved down to another country to be enriched and go out in another country to be exported as final product? The question is going to become, how do you create employment in your own country? Because we tend to forget that we have demographic issues that we have to address. Because if we do that, the question becomes, okay, It's our mines, it's our minerals. It's going out elsewhere, but it's not creating jobs here. If you tell us that we can move in those other countries, the recipient country is going to tell you, I have myself my own demographic issues. I cannot be receiving people coming from the DRC, coming to Zambia or to Zimbabwe to do the refining here because you want to create jobs for your minerals and everything. So we have all those different aspects that we need to take into account in that debate of we have to find local solution. I'm really totally for that, but I do believe also that it's really important to anticipate the pull between cooperation and competition in a way that we find a sustainable solution that allows really all the stakeholders that's going to take part in that situation to win.
I mean, I agree with you to the extent that there's going to be competition. So let's take, for example, I'm in a car, for instance, right? And this car, even this car as it is, even if you have all of the raw materials, no car today, or at least most cars today, require such a huge supply chain and a lot of negotiation between countries to ensure that supply chain moves very fluidly and every country get at least the most value you can get from what contributed to the price of this car. That is exactly what I'm talking about, even with critical minerals. The model today, any value addition is better than no value addition. And the current model today is no value addition in most overwhelming majority of all of the resources. So while countries would then have to compete, but can South Africa or can Zimbabwe compete with, say, DRC on cobalt? So I think the competition is bound to be there in cases where both countries have similar resources or similar base of resources or the same resources. So, but in cases where you don't have that, where one country overwhelmingly, like Zambia, for instance, with all of so much copper reserves, or the DRC has some copper as well, then they can work together. We are seeing this with cocoa as well. Let's look at cocoa, for instance, in West Africa. Yeah. You see, for instance, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, after so many years of not really playing to their strengths or playing to cooperation, they are beginning to work together to try to make the most out of their resource. And I think that's something that we can do with all of these critical minerals. As I said, all countries, actually very few countries really have real reserves that we can take seriously for decades to come. And it's not every country that can win in Africa with this energy transition. It is countries that either have reserves and that can go into refining, and countries who are just lucky enough to be around those countries and they can build a supply chain and piggyback off that. Yeah.
We talked about the international system. We talked about all the change that's happening and everything. Now we're talking about this cooperation. So I have the issue of the summit that's happened last year in South Africa, the BRICS summit, where we had a lot of African demand, African countries lining up to join the BRICS. They want to ask, they want to join the BRICS. Algeria even, wanted also, but finally when it got rejected, decided to give up on the idea of joining the BRICS altogether. Does the BRICS stand as a viable option for African country to consider it as a way to either recreate, either rebalance, either create the condition of rebalancing the current rule-based order?
When it comes to the BRICS, it never really started with this sort of very heavy and hefty
agendas.
Yeah. There was Russia, India, China coming together trying to see what can happen between them. And then Brazil came on board, or the South Africa came on board but later, yeah. And I think ever since South Africa came on board, or just when it became BRICS, that is where we started seeing this actor constellation forming into something of, okay, we want to put out some changes in political economy, because these are we're seen as very fast emerging growing countries. Brazil, for instance, South Africa to a large extent, China, of course, still a manufacturing hub. India seem to be the next big thing in terms of global economic prosperity. So they do have a lot in common in that regard. Now, in recent times, with the deterioration of the relationship of China-West relation, or even Russia and European and America, I think the BRICS is having to inherit that burden, because it never really, from the beginning, going by my understanding of those initial documents, and it never really set out to be this alternative to the G7 and all of that. And even in its structure, it still isn't, because it's not going like for like, it's okay, there are 7, we have to be 7. They're also very expansive. The text say it's all about collaboration, cooperation, trying to improve mutual understanding and all of that. Whether they can provide a counterweight from an economic perspective to the G7, definitely. Even now, they are already ahead of the G7 in terms of share of global economy, right? Exactly. Not by much, but significant. If you add all of the new countries coming in, even more significant, right? The challenge that I see with BRICS, from my view, is that you have even more competition between the members of the BRICS compared to the G7, for instance.
China and India, that heaviness of geopolitical tension. You have Iran and Saudi Arabia. You have Argentina that was supposed to join with Brazil, but Argentina declined. So you have a lot of context where at the end you have a lot of, not as much as cohesion that they want to show. They have much more division than cohesion, that comparing to G7 or EU members, for instance.
But if well managed, that could actually be one of its biggest strengths, because BRICS then becomes that platform where countries who disagree so much can actually be found on the same table, discussing a common agenda, as opposed to the G7. We recall the G7 used to be G8, and then Russia got kicked out. The G7 is all about, you could say, purity. We have to be ideologically aligned. We have to be economically aligned. Everything has to be one, you know. So that kind of approach seems very exclusionary, as opposed to BRICS, which does have a more consultative or consensus, okay, we can actually work with people who disagree with to reach out settlement on what the world should look like. Now, for Africa, can Africa rely on the BRICS to advance a new world order or a new global system? I think, first of all, Africa has to first articulate, and I think to a large extent we're doing that, what it wants the world to look like, right? If you are looking to a group of, maybe 10 countries to change the world, well, in Africa, you have over 50 countries. Why can't the 50 countries do it? We can't do it because we do not have the share of the global economy. We don't have the military power. We do not have those very key strategic assets to deploy to make the change. So maybe that is what we should be building, and then you don't even need to join the BRICS in the first place, right? Yeah.
We can do it by ourselves if we organize, if we make it really happen. I think that our challenges are both internal and external. That's why at the beginning, I do not really agree with the statement that President Tshisekedi has made. It made sense because I really agree on the sense of there's not much more of a respect. But for me, the criticism when we put toward G7 on Western country, it has to come from a place where we've done our part. We've really committed ourselves into doing things correctly before going into the approach of blaming others for what's happening to us. And now we are seeing all those changes happening in the world. We are seeing all those changes happening in that space. We're seeing China moving from what we used to do in Africa. I remember before starting the show, we were saying that we missed the opportunity when China was still giving money, a lot of money, African country. Now it's just changed. Now, before even moving to that part, let me just pick your brain on that. Do you think that China delivered? I would say, if I can say delivered, do you think that we took the opportunity that we're supposed to take out of China presence and heavy interest in Africa when it was still lending a lot of money to African countries?
If you look at in several countries, for instance, like Nigeria, my country, countries like Kenya, even Ethiopia, they were projects that they had the feasibility study for decades that they were not able to build because they couldn't access financing. The Abuja Kaduna Railway is a good example. Several energy projects in Zungeru, for instance, we've had a few. Most projects have been for decades. Nobody gave us finance for them. So there are instances where African countries did make very good use of the opportunity, right? And there are cases where we saw white elephant projects where finances could have been used for more pressing issues. And we've covered all of this all over. There's even as development we imagine, we've covered some of those projects as China Africa podcast or now China Global South projects. For many years, we've seen all of those things being highlighted. And this has led to changes even on the African side and also on the Chinese side on optimizing, the Belt and Road Initiative and all of that. If we understand that the Belt and Road Initiative fundamentally was about connectivity and not necessarily building all the infrastructure projects that all of the African countries or countries all over the world had in their shelf. But that primarily it was about connectivity and connecting economies in Africa, within Africa, with Asia, with Europe and all of that. Then countries who really moved in that direction of building connectivity projects, you could say they took a very, very good advantage, of it. Djibouti, Addis Ababa Railway, for instance, even the railway between cities in Nigeria, for instance, port projects. So yes, there were a lot of countries who did good in terms of making use of the BRI, peak Chinese lending. I was just reading a report now that we now have a situation where in 2022, only 9 sovereign loans from China are totally 1 billion. And if you compare that from 2000 to 2001, you had 54 loans at 7.4 billion. So there is a shift, change. And a lot of that is being felt across the continent. Now, the fundamentals of China-Africa relationship, in my opinion, I've been saying this, and I'm sure even Eric would agree that I've been saying this, it has always been political. People keep thinking that China-Africa relationship took off because of the BRI. Yes, what the BRI and FOCAC really did was expand the economic dimension of the relationship. For instance, China took the seats, at the United Nations over Taiwan, for instance. How much did Africa owe to China at that point? Probably $0, right? But exactly. Majority of the votes came from the continent because there's a solidarity and shared experience against colonial expansion and imperialism that really is at the core of the relationship. Yeah. That many people between 2000 to 2017 or whenever you want to put the date completely overlooked and keep thinking that it is a relationship about politics. And I'm going to even go further to embellish that point to say the countries who are going to even see more of this cooperation and see more of this lending and see more of that expansion in the economic sphere with China will be countries that have the politics right. Because if you look at the global environment today with all of the Cold War-like rhetoric and competition and strategic competition, the political dynamic of the relationship with China, your political relationship with China is going to be very, very crucial. Because if you have a situation where there's a change in government and deals can collapse or things can just go after so many months or years of negotiation, then why should I invest in that kind of market in the first place? So the geopolitical risk is up. So it means that political relationship is going to even be more important going to the future.
You're raising very interesting points. So my question is, where do we stand in all of that as Africa? Where do we stand? Because you really mentioned something that really struck me. Our relationship with China will become much more important politically, and we're going to have to look into what's going to happen there. So where do we stand in all of that? Because now you have a Cold-like situation where we are back almost in the 70s, 80s, where you talk about the rhetoric coming from Western capitals, Western countries. It's focused on security. We have to safeguard our supply chain. It's really a lot of security-focused rhetoric. It's like us versus them. We read back to that time. So when you have that and you see the strategic competition happening, the interest to come back to Africa, to talk about the PGII, Global Gateway, all those initiatives all come together. And you have also China being there. China changing, China going from a New Belt Road Initiative kind of approach, what I call the BRI 2.0. The question is, where do we stand in that configuration? Keeping in mind the internal dynamic of many African countries where now you have coups that happen in Sahel and everything, the landscape changing. The US that was hoping that, Niger will be much more amicable to them. Now they're kicking them out to let the Russian coming in. All of that, where do we stand? And how do we approach that tumultuous period that's coming ahead of us? Do we have to anticipate regime change coming from outside, or we are really away from that period? We have new dynamics that are going to happen.
With the deterioration of relations between China and the US and also with Russia and also with Europe, the thing about the Cold War is that, and this has been said many times, it's Cold War for the main players and a hot war for the rest of the world who do not understand how to play with the main players. Yeah, exactly. So the Cold War era was very devastating for the continent. And the dynamics are very clear, again, that we're entering that space. So there's a space race, again, is back. Talk about weaponizing space. There is fragmentation and collapse of multilateralism. Then the UN Security Council and UN can't really do anything anymore. We're seeing coups. And so all of the dynamics we saw during the Cold War are coming back. And if Africa is to protect itself, and not protect itself, but also capitalize on the dynamics, because this is politics at the end of the day, it has to understand what red lines it has to draw in all of its relationship with all of these players. Yeah. One of the mistakes a country can make in this kind of environment is hosting military bases. Because by doing that, you are automatically aligning yourself. That's why in Niger, for instance,
you have the case of Djibouti. Where you have American, Chinese, Europeans all together, though. That's
I mean, Djibouti is an exceptional case in a sense for a couple of reasons. One, those bases are there primarily, yes, for competition, but for logistical reasons, as opposed to competing with China or with the US. Because when the competition is that steep and very Cold War-like, we can't have both bases in the same country. But now, Djibouti, in many ways, you could say, hosts over 7 bases. The Italians are there, the Japanese are there, the Chinese are there, the Americans are there. Everybody is there. Everybody is there. But next door to Djibouti, we have countries like Somalia, countries that hosted those big bases like Limonier that were really about, counterterrorism and all of that. So it still has that component to it. But we know that all of these bases are going to play a role in the competition amongst each other. Foreign military bases should be only when you really want to align. You cannot have a military base and say you're not aligned, we want to stay out of, every African leader likes to say that they don't want to play a role in the Cold War or in group competition. They want to be able to deal with both sides. No, you can't do that when you have a military base of one side in your country. You just can't eat your cake and have it. So that's the first thing, because one, it makes you a target for the other side, and then two, makes you an accomplice in whatever operation was done to a neighboring African country from that base. Yeah. So this is going to be very, very crucial for countries going forward. And you can already see it with all of the anxiety about whether China wants to build a naval base in this country or that country, Equatorial Guinea or that. And even now in the news in Nigeria now, there's news about the US wanting and France discussing with Nigerian government, of which the government has come out to say that's not happening because of the uproar about even the idea that the Nigerian government is discussing hosting French or American bases, on Nigerian soil. So we understand that very well here. And I think in most countries, they will have to come to that, because in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, they are already choosing a particular pole in their engagement. It serves their interest now because they are trying to push out the French and the Americans and all of that. But how will they be able to manage the downstream complications of this relationship? I think that remains to be seen, because things get ugly very fast.
Because let's face it, we talk about Russia, big game, but Russia never really invested in those countries so far, except security support with the Wagner group. But we haven't seen a lot of Russia economic and industrial engagement in those countries either. So it's not like they're winning by becoming pro-Russia. I have nothing against Russia, but we have to keep a cold mind when you really think about those issues, that are we really winning, or it's just a kind of whims that, because we hate French, because we don't like them, we are siding with those. But at the end, are we really winning in that battle?
Yeah, that's something I actually wrote about in 2022 for SIRE, looking at Russia private military diplomacy in Africa, what that really means. And like I said, you have to understand how these countries are defining winning in the first place. The main priority of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali is security. It's not first economic. It is security, and first of all, it starts with regime security. So in the hierarchy of the objectives. So if you can achieve regime security first and foremost, because they know that coups and counter coups are a thing. We've seen assassination attempts on Assimi Goïta of Mali. I'm sure there are so many things that have not been reported that are happening under the cover, right? So they know that they first have to secure themselves and the regime. Then security is broadened to include national security and counterterrorism. which they are collaborating with Russia, with Wagner. Now this changed to different organizations, the Redoute and all of that. So that is how you have to view this. And in that paper, I made the case that aligning with Russia actually comes with serious diplomatic costs. You would find that the West will not want to collaborate with you. There are so many programs in the country that is being funded by the West that you are going to lose access to. And we've seen that happen because that is just the environment that we're in. At the same time, we also see these countries also now moving into resource nationalism to try to make up for those lost funding.
Exactly.
The Burkina Faso talking about gold refining and they moving in that direction. Mali doing the same thing, talking about how they want to even tap more into their resources for themselves. Niger already now have a pipeline going through Benin Republic on pumping out barrels of. So the economics of Russia-Africa relationship is still very, very low and doesn't represent the political relationship. And that is because it is never about economics in the first place. It is a deeply political relationship, political and security relationship. It's also security because, independence came out of so much support from the USSR. Russia-Africa trade is about $18 billion. Turkey trades more with Africa, actually.
Russia.
More than $38 billion. Even Brazil at about $19 billion. So the Russians have a lot of catching up to do on the economic front. And I reckon that they are working in that direction. But for Africa, the way to analyze the relationship is first looking at the attitude of the government. In Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, it is in that way I've explained. In Nigeria, it is very different because we have a different system. I'm sure in DRC also, it's going to be different. In South Africa, it's also very, very different. It's more complex. I like to see South Africa, Algeria, gold standard in Russia-Africa relationship. These countries are, and Morocco also, the Morocco, South Africa, Algeria, Egypt, these four countries represent over 80 or 90% of Russia-Africa engagement. Think about that. So trade engagement. So it says a lot.
So, Ovigwe, we had lots to talk about, but we did not cover everything. I'm really going to be happy to have you for another conversation, to continue this conversation. For those who've been following China in Africa podcast, you're going to notice that this was a bit of a change. We did not go with a specific topic. We really wanted to have that conversation between two friends, between two experts on that topic. So, Ovigwe, we are wrapping up this conversation. The question was the tectonic change that's happening in Africa. Who are the winners and who are the losers? So, from what you see, from what we are perceiving that's happening, from the changes that we've been reading and following up how it's going to happen, taking into account all the elements, critical minority debates, the security around those issues, the supply chain, the security element, the coups and the political, the change in international system, the tension and everything. Who, when I say who, not specifically, namely those African countries, but who's going to be the winner, not name them, but who's going to be the winner or who's going to be the loser by doing what exactly in that context?
Now, that's a very good question and a very good way to bring everything together. The winning has to be, from the perspective of critical minerals and resources, has to be the partnership that delivers the most value for value addition, right? The most support for value addition, and the partnership that allows Africa to move up the value chain in the resource space. And from that perspective, if you go by that, that's from the economic perspective of that, at least that dynamic, you could say China it's definitely a winning partner, because we just talked about Zimbabwe just now, right?
Yeah.
And then if you look at Angola, for instance, the Angolan president was just in China.
You even wrote a paper on that,
for a diplomat, about how they want to attract investment into expanding their refining capacity and a lot of that in petrochemicals also. So we see the West talking about value addition, right? But we don't see a lot of it coming out. So this is not to say that China doesn't do mine to port. It does. But we have China doing more than just mine to port. And the Lobito corridor, which has just been announced, is classic old mine to port.
But this is the Western initiative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is G7 initiative.
We have the Tazara on the other side, though.
That's what I'm saying. So the thing is, you can have Tazara on one hand with China, but you can also have what is happening in Zimbabwe. That is that I'm saying China seems to be the more winning partner on that perspective. Now, on the perspective of the broader issue of reforming the global economic space, which Africa is talking about, which is all things considered, on debt, on lending, on DSSI, on all of those initiatives, on energy transition and all of that. I think this is one area where every partner on the continent, with the continent of Africa right now, is a winning partner. The US is doing a lot in Angola, for instance, investment in the solar space. The US is doing a lot in countries like Morocco, even in Nigeria, for instance. John Kerry, who is the climate envoy for Biden administration, was here about a year ago. So China also is a player in the solar space and all of that. So in that area, I think Africa has a lot to gain, or have winning partners in that broader sense. Now, if we go to the security domain, winning again here has to be the partnership that allows African countries to pursue their security from their own understanding of the challenges and their understanding of the solutions to those challenges. Again, we have a lot of complaint and concern from the African continent around the so-called African solutions to African problems. What does that look like? What it looks like is, for instance, we had the EAC force trying to solve the problem in East Africa. Yes, there are challenges, but within the EAC themselves, they are sitting down to discuss their challenges. Nobody is telling them, oh no, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do this. That is different from the G5 Sahel force in West Africa, which has failed completely. And the G5 Sahel force essentially was a force put together by France, and it couldn't do anything. Under the G5 Sahel force, Burkina Faso lost 40% of its territory to terrorists. That's a failed project. So when I was criticizing the G5 Sahel force, people thought it was about criticizing cooperation and pushing nationalism. No. Now in West Africa, we see the so-called Sahel Alliance coming together. It is not about, they know that they can't do it by themselves. They have to come together, but they have to do it the way they want to do it. So that is how the winning would look like in the security space. And winning also look like not being a launch pad for any power in the greater geopolitical and security competition. You don't want to get into that because it's going to get very, 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 very nasty. Security space, two things. One, the partnership that allow us to develop our security solutions by ourselves, or not allow us, rather, more than do not start to stand in our way when we want to solve our security problems the way we want to do it. Don't be in the way of Africa. And then secondly, do not pressure or coerce us into being in any camp. That for me is the thing to look out for winning in the security space. So security, economics, those are the two things I want to highlight.
Ovigwe, very much thank you to have you in that conversation. And I'm really looking forward to following up on that conversation because a lot is going to happen. And definitely we're going to need that new perspective, that debate to happen again. So for those who've been following us on the China Africa podcast, for those who are going to be watching us on YouTube, it was really my pleasure to really host that special edition that was a combination of the China Global South interviews and the China in Africa podcast. I'm Christian Géraud, the Africa editor of the China Global South, and I was joined by Ovigwe Eguegu from Nigeria, a geopolitical analyst. You can find all his details and information. We're going to put that in the show notes. You're going to see the last pieces he published about Angola and why Angola going to China is somehow good for the G7. I think I got it right. And you're going to find really good details on that. So for me, it's going to be the end of this show. I'm going to see you next week where I'm going to be joined by Eric and Kobus for another edition of the China in Africa podcast. And for the China in the Global South interview, we're going to have another guest for next week for just continuing having those conversations about China in the Global South and what's happening and what we should be looking forward to. For the China Global South project, I say thank you and see you next week.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.